Welcome to week 2 of corporate and organizational leadership. If you're tuning back in this week, I assume you made it through week 1 and you're ready to continue on. So congratulations on your first week's accomplishment. And this week we're going to shift gears a little bit. If you recall, last week we talked about what's called the trait approaches. And the trait approaches in leadership have to do with the characteristics and qualities of the person, of the leader himself or herself. And so we said on the one hand it was a good approach to look at leadership because we could look at certain characteristics like intelligence, people skills, those sorts of things. We also said it was kind of challenging because it wasn't as easy to train for those things, nor was there the definitive list, Plus two, there are so many other ways of conceptualizing leadership that are important as well. And so this week we're going to move on and we're going to look at our next approach to leadership, which is what's known as the behavioral approach. And so what happened was as the trait approach began to wind down and people began to say, well, there's no list, there's no trainability, we're not sure how useful this is, other concepts about human personality interaction began to emerge. And really the beginning point for the behavioral approach to leadership began with the Hawthorne studies and Elton Mayo. And I know some of you are thinking that Elton Mayo was the guy who invented mayonnaise, but you're wrong. Elton Mayo was the person behind the Hawthorne studies. And some of you might recall from your early psych classes the Hawthorne effect. And what's the Hawthorne effect? The Hawthorne effect says that sometimes we conduct an experiment and we'll get these unintended consequences. And so the Hawthorne effect is pretty well known, but the original study actually is what gave us useful information on understanding leadership and management behavior. And essentially what happened was you had the researchers coming in and they were trying to affect change in the environment, right? And so they went into this relay plan and they changed some things and they changed some lighting and they changed the positions of the table and they altered the breaks, that the women got. And what they realized was that the performance of those people, the performance of the women in the plant actually went up, not because of the changes that they were affecting in the environment, but rather because the women were being involved and brought into the decision-making process, and that they were being made to feel valuable, and they weren't just cogs in a machine. Here, you sit here and do your task, but their opinions were solicited. And so this was a real, today it seems to us kind of like very simple and basic, but back then it was a real aha moment because they realized, if we get people involved, if we encourage them to be part of the process and not just sticking them in a role and telling them what to do, that mere act of their involvement and participation in the process increases productivity. And so that was a watershed moment and really has informed leadership and management studies and organizational behavior theory ever since. So the point of all this is that when managers care, productivity goes up and that people's feelings matter in the whole process. So this whole feeling side began to enter into the equation as well. So moving ahead, by the way, I am walking through the slides, so if you haven't viewed those, you should, or try to open those up side by side and walk through as well. So this leads us to what is called the style approach. And so where the trait approach emphasizes the characteristics of the leader, the style approach emphasizes the behavior of the leader. Okay, so we have the traits and the behavior. Now, through the Ohio State studies came something called the LBDQ, which was basically a questionnaire that looked at what do leaders and managers actually do on a day-to-day basis. So they began to look at what they do, and they were able to boil it down into 2 key behaviors. Okay, and are you ready for those? They are the task behavior versus people behavior. Okay, so let's start with task behavior. What is that? That is a high concern for getting the job done. Okay, that has to do with initiating structure, with setting goals, with setting up policies, procedures, all those sort of things. Keeping an eye on what needs to get done, the task, so to speak, okay? Then the other dimension is the people orientation, and that is a concern for the people involved and concern for their well-being, for their welfare, for their participation, just for them as human beings. And so you can see these two ideas here, task versus people, are very important, because when we work with people, right, we're not just working with cogs in a machine, but we're working with human beings. And so this behavioral approach says that leaders and managers always need to be aware of the fact that there's tasks to be done, but there's also people that are involved in getting those tasks done. And so you'll see this idea brought up. It's referred to differently in different places: task versus people, initiating structure versus consideration. It's also called in some other models. But that's the basic idea, is that you have these two dimensions. Okay, so Blake and Mouton then sort of plotted this out now. So if you have imagine you have a, what do you call it, one of those plots, with X, Y, and A, B. And you could have 4 dimensions, 4 different styles of leadership, depending on how high or low you were on the people behavior and how high and low you are on the task behavior. And so there's 5 different styles. And so if you skip ahead, you'll see Blake and Mouton's grid. And so leaders that are high on concern for people but low on concern for task will have sort of a country club feel to their organizations. It's all about the people, it's all about getting along, it's all about consideration, but the task, well, that's secondary. That's not really about the task. And so you can see from a productivity standpoint, that's not going to be your best option, is it? And then on the other extreme end, those who are high concern for task and low concern for people, so high task, low people, their organizations are going to have an authoritarian feel, right? It's sort of a slave driver. Hey, we got to get stuff done. I don't care about how you feel. And that's not very optimal either. And then, of course, you have leaders that are low task and low people. This is what we call impoverished leadership. Nothing gets done. Nobody's cared about. That organization will fail pretty quick. And then you have what Blake and Mouton call high, right? High concern for people, high concern for tasks. This is what they would call a team leader, okay? Somebody who's all about individuals and their well-being and their participation, and is also all about the task and getting the job done. So they would argue that high is optimal. Now, later on when we get to the situational approaches, we'll see that high isn't always optimal, but sometimes there's different factors in the situation that would require either being high or low on one or the other. But we'll save that. I believe next week we'll get to situational leadership. But for right now, it's just important to grasp this concept that there's these 2 main behaviors that leaders engage in: their people behavior versus their task behavior. Okay, and so moving along then, there's a question here in the PowerPoint. You might just want to take a moment and pause and think about yourself. If you took the test in Northhouse that talked about your own behavior, whether you were high or task or high on people, you might say, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it like this. I am kind of a high task and low people. Well, this is going to affect your leadership effectiveness. Or you might be a high people, low task person. This too will affect impact your effectiveness. If you're too high on people, too low on task, sometimes productivity goes down. Sometimes things don't get done. It's all about people's concerns. So it's an important point of self-awareness to realize which of these you prefer, which of these are sort of the dominant tendencies in your own leadership style. Okay, so the next idea we want to look at that's sort of born out of this is McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y. This is one of the first cool theory names. We're going to talk about Theory X and Theory Y. Wow. All right, so what does that have to do? Well, Theory X and Theory Y has to do with a leader's basic assumptions and worldview about other human beings. And these assumptions and values about other people's will really to a large degree dictate their style in terms of this task versus behavior. So it states that leaders take one of 2 views of other people, their followers, and that these views are generally not stated. That makes them assumptions, right? So nobody's going to come right out and say, well, I believe this or that about you, but it will be indicative of their behavior towards other people. You'll be able to tell whether they're X or Y by their behavior. So here we go. What is Theory X? Theory X takes a negative assumption about people and their attitude towards work. It assumes that people dislike work, that people need to be directed and controlled, and that people want security and not responsibility. And so if a leader holds Theory X assumptions, they'll tend to be more authoritative, authoritarian. They won't give others room for significant participation. They won't delegate meaningful tasks, and they'll be more controlling. And you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, I've worked for a few Theory X people before in my life. It's no fun. Okay, so, and again, people aren't going to come out and say this, well, I think you're all a bunch of lazy people and I really need to control everything you do, but that's sort of the assumption that they have. It's part of their worldview and belief about other people, and so it bears on how they go about leading others. And then there's Theory Y, okay, so you got X and Y. What is Y? It makes a more positive assumption about people and their attitude towards work. It says that people like work, that people are self-motivated, and that people accept and seek responsibility. And so if a leader holds Theory Y assumptions, they'll tend to allow more autonomy for their followers. They'll delegate meaningful tasks. They'll give others room in the decision-making process and encourage and reward creativity and innovation. All right, and so maybe you've been blessed and you've actually worked for some Theory Y leaders who've allowed you to participate. They really value you. They seem like they want you, that you're an important part of the organization. They brought you into important decisions. And it's a much better feeling, isn't it, if somebody really values us as human beings, they appreciate us, and that they want to give us some responsibility in the whole thing. So again, this is a good kind of reality check for yourself. You know, ask yourself, which of these do you believe? And if you're high Theory X, you know, you're going to be more authoritarian, and you'll seek to control others and dictate how the work should be done. And you know, there's a lot of reasons, without psychoanalyzing us, there's a lot of reasons why people hold these behaviors. Sometimes people have these real controlling personalities, and it's just, you know, it's hard for them to relinquish control. If you're high Theory Y, you'll tend to be more democratic. You'll want to bring people in the participation. You don't like to be authoritarian or dictate. You want to see what other people think and bring them into the process as well. And then, of course, there's the laissez-faire. And this is sort of like the low that we talked about in the Blake and Mouton model. You know, they're low, they're very hands-off. It's non-leadership. It's not really concerned for people or for the work. So ask yourself, which of these do you tend to lean towards, and is that a good thing? You know, if you're kind of Theory X, you think, yeah, now that I understand this, I am kind of Theory X. And you have to understand the negative impact that it's going to have on others. You know, for the most part, people want meaningful participation. They want to have some input. They want to have some say. They want to have some control over their own work environment. And so if you're a high Theory X kind of person, you're not going to allow that. And you maybe not even going to realize how that is negatively affecting your workers and the productivity of your organization. So if you want to grow as a leader, and I assume you do because you're in this class, then you need to understand that. You need to try to get at the root of it and try to correct it so that you can move over and become more Theory Y, which has been proven to be more of an effective leadership style. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about, and this sort of comes out of the behavioral approaches, but it's an approach unto itself, is the skills approach, all right? The skills approach, all right? So we've had traits, we've had behaviors, and now we're going to talk about skills. And as the name implies, the skills approach is about things that the leader can do to improve, to be well-rounded, and to be effective. And so it's a leader-centered perspective. The emphasis is on skills and abilities that can be learned and developed. And I think that's the key here because, again, we talked early in the class about this premise that leadership is something that can be developed. It's not just something that we learn by happenstance, through circumstances, you know, school of hard knocks, all those kinds of things your grandfather told you, but there are some abilities that we can learn. So the skills approach really plays well into that assumption about life. And so a definition is the skills approach. Leadership skills is the ability to use one's knowledge and competencies to accomplish a set of goals and objectives. All right, so we're going to look at two main ones here. The first one is by Katz, and this is back from the 50s. And Katz conceptualized leadership skills according to 3 different dimensions. And I'm going to explain these all in a minute here. But the first is technical, and then human, and then conceptual. All right, so let's break that down. What are technical skills? Technical skills has to do with knowledge about being proficient in a specific type of work or activity. Specialized competencies, analytic ability, use of appropriate tools and techniques. All right, so somebody who has high technical skills, they really understand what this job is about. Okay, so example, maybe if you're in the legal profession. Man, you're a great lawyer. You understand the law. You understand how to evaluate the law, apply the law. Maybe you've got good courtroom skills. I mean, all these kinds of things that lawyers do. Very important, very foundational. And a lot of people sort of start their leadership and management careers by having very high technical skills. Now, but what we'll learn here is that high technical skills doesn't necessarily, it's not the totality of all leadership skills. There's a couple of others here that are just as important. And the next one are the human skills. Human skills, having knowledge about being something and being able to work with people. Being aware of one's own perspective and other perspective at the same time, assisting group members in working collaboratively, cooperatively to achieve common goals, and creating an atmosphere of trust and empowerment of the members. Okay, so this kind of gets back to the people skill, right, from the task people idea. It also has to do with the theory why, right, the belief in other people and their abilities and their desires to participate, to give people room for meaningful participation. So this is the second competency that leaders must have. And the third one is conceptual. All right, so you've got technical, people, and then the third is conceptual. And this has to do with the ability to do the mental work in shaping meaning of organizational policy of issues. And so at this level, you need to be able to work easily with abstraction and hypotheticals. You need to be able to think about vision and strategy. All right, so this is sort of getting out of the day-to-day mundane and the ability to sort of create an alternate future, an alternate reality for your organization in the future. Alternate reality, that sounds like a sci-fi movie, but you know what I'm talking about. To be able to think strategically and to move the organization in a new and better direction. So, if you go back to the initial slide here, you'll see that what Katz would say is that at the lower levels of leadership, when we're talking more about supervisory roles, that the technical skills is vitally important, and the conceptual skills isn't quite as important, right? So you really need to understand your job, and this idea of being able to think strategically and all those sorts of things, work with people, not quite as important. And as you move up then to middle management, now they become more important. The technical skill is still important, but now your human and your conceptual skills need to improve as well. And then for a top management role, your technical skills, it doesn't need to be as high, but you need to excel in some of these people and conceptual skills. Now, why is that? Think about it for a minute. If you're a frontline worker, you need to know how to do that task. But if you're in a top management role, you're going to have a lot of people under you in line and staff positions, and they need to become the experts, and you need to be able to think about bigger picture issues, about where we're going in this organization. Are we doing things right in the first place? Why are we doing what we're doing, right? Remember, we talked about leaders as doing the right things versus managers doing things right. And so these conceptual and people skills become much more important in order for us to move up into higher roles of management and leadership. Okay, so we continue on. The next approach is one by Mumford et al., Mumford-Zuccaro. And this is also a skills-based model, but it's a little more complex. Okay, it adds some other factors in there. So it also has to do with individual competencies, individual attributes, but there's some other things, and I think I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase on this one. I think that sort of add to the complexity and usefulness of this model. And not only does it have to do with our technical skills, our people skills, right, conceptual, strategic thinking sorts of things, but it has to do, it also brings in personality, so it kind of harkens back to the trait approach, right? Any characteristics that can help us deal with complex situations. So when you think about personality characteristics, people that are open to experience, right? People who are who have that ability to reason complexly, those are going to be beneficial, obviously, in a leadership role. But I think that the main contribution here has to do with the outside factors. So those all have to do with the person of the leader himself or herself, But this model then also adds career experiences and environmental influences. So what are career experiences? Well, these are things that we can be involved in. They're going to help us develop as leaders. So for example, challenging assignments. And this is what's also called stretch jobs, job rotation. If we're exposed, or even different jobs, moving from job to job, if we're exposed to different kinds of ideas and different experiences and opportunities, that is going to help us develop all of those things, right? Technical, conceptual, human skills. And then there's this idea of mentoring. If there's somebody involved in our lives who can speak into our lives, who sees our performance and kind of help us course correct along the way, people that we can reflect with, that is another beneficial learning growth opportunity. Training is important, and hands-on experience with novelty. Okay, so this idea that we get to try new things. And then there's the environmental influences. And sometimes, the organization itself either promotes or hinders good leadership development. Think about it. If you work in an organization, has no vision, has no strategy, has a lot of Theory X kind of managers working there, right? There's probably not going to be a whole lot of opportunities for you to grow as a leader. But on the other hand, if you're an organization and there's a lot of Theory Y leaders, or there's creativity, innovation, strategy, all those kinds of things, that's going to help you develop as a leader as well. So in addition to the technical, human, conceptual skills, you have these environmental factors, the experience, the situation, the feel of the organization itself, that is going to help determine your own development as a leader. All right, so in Northouse, he sort of gives the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. Just to kind of sum it all up, it's a descriptive approach. It provides some structure. It's teachable, right? So we can teach a lot of these things. Maybe some of the personality things are a little more static, but for the most part, these are teachable skills. So if you're trying to develop a leadership development environment in your organization, you need to give people opportunities for growth. You need to help them work on their people skills, conceptual skills. You need to do job rotation, job assignment change, giving people opportunities for growth. That will help your organization to raise the leadership, water level, so to speak. So it is a teachable thing. Criticize, some people think, well, it's a bit of a laundry list, includes every possible, thing that someone could do in an organization, so maybe it's a little broad. So trying to narrow it down on the fundamentals is good.